Something historic is happening right now. The world is quietly moving away from a system that has shaped global life for nearly 80 years. Power is spreading, rules are breaking, and the countries that once set the terms no longer control the game. What's emerging next isn't chaos, it's something far more complex. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the new world order isn't coming. It's already here. While you are at it, please click like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment below. For most people alive today, the global system feels permanent. Stable trade routes, a dominant reserve currency, global institutions that claim to speak for the world. But none of this is ancient. All of it was designed deliberately after one moment in history. That moment was the end of World War II. The world that emerged from that conflict was shattered. Europe was devastated. Asia was rebuilding. Colonial empires were collapsing. And one country stood above all others in power, wealth, and influence: the United States. With its industrial base intact and its military unmatched, the United States helped design a global system that reflected its interests. This wasn't done secretly, and it wasn't necessarily malicious. It was practical. The goal was stability, predictability, and preventing another global catastrophe. So the post-war order was built on a few core ideas: open trade, shared institutions, security alliances, and a rules-based framework led by Western powers. For decades, this system appeared to work. But the system carried a flaw from the beginning. It assumed Western dominance would last forever. When the Cold War ended, something unprecedented happened. The world briefly became unipolar. One dominant power, one military hegemon, one financial center, one set of rules that everyone else was expected to follow. This period became known as globalization. Trade expanded rapidly. Supply chains stretched across continents. Capital moved freely. Technology spread faster than ever before. For many countries, this brought growth. But for many others, it created dependency. Manufacturing shifted away. Local industries collapsed. Economic decisions were increasingly made far from the people affected by them. The benefits were real, but uneven. And over time, resentment grew. Not only in the global South, but inside Western countries themselves. Workers felt left behind. Communities hollowed out. Inequality widened. The unipolar moment was powerful, but fragile, because it depended on one thing above all else: continued American willingness to lead, enforce, and pay the costs of global order. That willingness is now fading. While attention remained focused on Western dominance, something else was happening quietly. The rest of the world was catching up. Asia industrialized. Africa urbanized. Latin America diversified. Hundreds of millions of people entered the global economy. With that growth came confidence. Countries that had once been rule takers began asking why they weren't rule makers. They didn't want to overthrow the system. They wanted influence within it. But global institutions remained frozen in a world designed decades earlier. Economic power had shifted. Political power had not. That mismatch created pressure. And pressure creates change. The global South did not unite under one ideology. Instead, it embraced pragmatism, non-alignment, issue-by-issue cooperation, strategic flexibility. This is the foundation of the emerging multiplex world. Not one center of power, but many overlapping ones. The old model assumed hierarchy. One leader, clear rules, predictable alliances. The new model is layered. Regional powers assert influence locally. Global powers compete selectively. Institutions overlap rather than dominate. This is what defines a multiplex system. Not chaos, but complexity. Power doesn't disappear. It spreads. This makes the world harder to control, but also harder to dominate. Trade begins to fragment. Supply chains regionalize. Security alliances become conditional. Countries hedge instead of choosing sides. This shift is not ideological rebellion. It's survival strategy. And it leads directly to the next transformation shaping the new world order: economic nationalism. For decades, efficiency mattered more than resilience. If something was cheaper abroad, it was imported. If labor was cheaper elsewhere, production moved. That logic dominated global economics. Until reality intervened. Supply disruptions, financial crises, pandemics, geopolitical conflict. Governments began to realize something uncomfortable. Efficiency without control is vulnerability. So the pendulum started swinging back toward domestic manufacturing, toward strategic industries, toward trade barriers and industrial policy. This does not end globalization. It reshapes it into regional blocks, strategic partnerships, selective decoupling. The result is a world that is less integrated but more politically driven. And this shift changes everything, including alliances. If power is spreading, trade is fragmenting, and old alliances are weakening, then what replaces the Western-led rules-based order? What happens when shared values stop being the glue that holds the system together? In the next part, we'll explore post-Western values, sovereign nation-state realism, and why practical cooperation is replacing ideology. And later, we'll confront the most dangerous question of all. What happens when nuclear weapons spread in a world with fewer rules? For decades, the global system was described as rules-based. That phrase sounded neutral, orderly, fair. But in practice, those rules were enforced unevenly. Some countries were punished for breaking them. Others were forgiven. Some were sanctioned. Others were shielded. Over time, this inconsistency became impossible to ignore. For many nations outside the West, the rules-based order began to feel less like shared law and more like selective enforcement. This didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, through exceptions, loopholes, and power politics. And eventually, confidence in the system began to erode. The post-war order was built not only on power, but on values. Democracy, liberal markets, human rights. These ideas were presented as universal. But many countries experienced them differently. Some saw progress. Others saw interference. Others saw instability. As the world diversified economically and politically, a new idea gained traction: sovereignty above all else. In this worldview, nations reject external judgment. They resist moral lectures. They prioritize internal stability over ideological alignment. This is not isolationism. It is strategic independence. Countries want flexibility, not allegiance. They want cooperation without submission. And that mindset is spreading. During the Cold War, ideology defined sides. After it ended, values replaced ideology as the organizing principle. But values are harder to enforce than power. Economic interdependence blurred moral lines. Security cooperation crossed political systems. Technology linked governments with competing visions of society. As crises multiplied, values became secondary to outcomes. Energy security mattered more than democracy promotion. Supply chains mattered more than political alignment. Stability mattered more than ideals. This didn't mean values disappeared. It meant they stopped being decisive. Practical cooperation replaced moral consensus. Alliances are strongest when interests align naturally. But as economic nationalism rises and power shifts, alliances become conditional. Countries now ask different questions. What do I gain? What do I risk? What happens if circumstances change? This creates flexible partnerships rather than permanent blocks. Friends today, neutral tomorrow, transactional always. Even long-standing alliances feel strain under this logic. Trust becomes thinner, commitments more cautious, expectations lower. The world doesn't divide cleanly anymore. It overlaps. In a multiplex world, countries don't choose sides, they choose issues. They may cooperate with one power on trade, another on security, a third on technology. This creates a system that is harder to predict, but also harder to control. No single country sets the agenda everywhere. Influence becomes regional, situational, and temporary. Power flows rather than concentrates. This is the opposite of the post-war model, and it sets the stage for a new form of global rivalry. Not ideology versus ideology, but power versus power. People often describe today's world as chaotic, but what they are really experiencing is transition. Old rules still exist, but no longer dominate. New rules are forming, but not yet fixed. This creates uncertainty. Markets react faster. Politics becomes reactive. Crisis management replaces long-term planning. The system feels unstable because it is being renegotiated in real time. And the most important renegotiation involves two countries above all others: the United States and China. If the world is no longer unipolar and not yet fully multipolar, does that mean it's becoming bipolar again? Is a new G2 world emerging, dominated by the United States and China? And if so, what happens to everyone else caught between them? In the next part, we'll explore the rise of U.S.-China rivalry, why they are deeply dependent on each other, and why that interdependence may make the future more fragile, not safer. As the unipolar era fades, many observers ask the same question. If one power no longer dominates, who replaces it? The answer, increasingly, appears to be two powers: the United States and China, not as allies, not as mirror images, but as the two largest centers of gravity in the global system. This does not mean the world returns to the Cold War. The structure looks similar on the surface, but the dynamics are very different. During the Cold War, the two sides were largely separated. Today, they are deeply entangled. Economically, technologically, financially. This makes the rivalry more complex and potentially more dangerous. Unlike past rivalries, the US and China are bound together by interdependence. Trade flows between them remain enormous. Supply chains cross both economies. Financial markets react to decisions made in both capitals. Neither side can fully disengage without harming itself. This creates a paradox. Each side views the other as a strategic threat, yet relies on the other for growth, stability, and technological inputs. This is not zero-sum competition. It's constrained rivalry, and that constraint shapes every decision. In this new rivalry, territory matters less than systems. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, data control, energy infrastructure. These become the strategic high ground. Technology determines productivity. Productivity determines power. Power determines influence. Both countries know this. So competition shifts from armies to ecosystems. Who controls standards? Who controls platforms? Who controls supply chains? This battle is quieter than military conflict, but just as consequential. At first glance, a bipolar world seems stable. Two powers balance each other. Rules emerge through rivalry. Smaller states align for protection. But the U.S.-China relationship lacks the clarity of past bipolar systems. There are no fixed red lines, no shared framework of restraint, no mutually accepted hierarchy. Instead, there is ambiguity, and ambiguity increases risk. Miscalculation becomes more likely. Signals are misread. Actions escalate unintentionally. This makes crisis management harder, not easier. Most countries do not want to choose between Washington and Beijing. They want access to both markets. Security without dependency. Growth without alignment. So they hedge. They cooperate where it benefits them. They resist pressure where it doesn't. This creates a fragmented global landscape. No single block. No unified response. Multiple overlapping strategies. In this environment, middle powers gain leverage. But they also face greater risk. Ironically, the U.S.-China rivalry doesn't freeze the world into two camps. It pushes others to assert independence. Regional powers expand influence. New institutions form. Alternative financial systems develop. The rivalry creates space. And that space fills quickly. This is how bipolarity transforms into true multipolarity. Not by design, but by consequence. If great powers are competing without clear rules, and middle powers are asserting autonomy, what happens when conflict erupts? What role do wars, crises, and systemic shocks play in reshaping global order? In the next part, we'll examine how disruption, from Ukraine to future conflicts, accelerates the breakdown of the old system and forces the creation of new rules under pressure. Global systems rarely collapse from gradual decline alone. They change through disruption. Wars, financial crises, pandemics, energy shocks. These events expose weaknesses that were already present but ignored. The post-war order was no different. Its cracks widened during moments of stress. And today, those stresses are multiplying. The world isn't drifting into a new order. It's being pushed. The war in Ukraine is often framed as a regional conflict, but its impact is global. It shattered assumptions about security in Europe. It accelerated energy realignment. It exposed the limits of sanctions as a universal tool. For some countries, the war reinforced Western unity. For many others, it highlighted selective enforcement. Different rules, different responses, different expectations. This widened the credibility gap. Countries began asking whether alignment guaranteed protection or simply risk. Sanctions were designed to isolate. In practice, they also encouraged adaptation. Alternative trade routes formed. New payment systems emerged. Local production increased. Instead of reinforcing a single system, Sanctions fractured it. This didn't weaken the global economy. It diversified it. And diversification reduces central control. Russia's future remains uncertain. Collapse, stagnation, reintegration, realignment. Each outcome reshapes global power differently. But regardless of outcome, one fact remains. The old European security architecture no longer exists. Trust is broken. Assumptions are invalid. Red lines are blurred. This forces all actors to rethink strategy. In a fragmented world, long-term planning becomes difficult. Leaders manage emergencies rather than design futures. This creates reactive governance. Short-term fixes, temporary coalitions, issue-specific responses. The system still functions, but barely. And under this pressure, institutional reform becomes unavoidable. As crises multiply, instability becomes familiar. Markets adapt. Governments normalize emergency powers. Societies recalibrate expectations. What once felt shocking becomes routine. This doesn't mean the world is collapsing. It means it is transforming. And the transformation is far from complete. If crises are forcing change faster than diplomacy can manage, what happens to global institutions designed for a different era? Can the United Nations, financial systems, and international law adapt? Or will they be replaced entirely? In the next part, we'll explore institutional reform, power redistribution, and whether a new global architecture is emerging or breaking apart. Most global institutions were created for a world that no longer exists. They were designed when power was concentrated, when populations were smaller, when economic flows were slower. Their rules reflect the aftermath of World War II, not the realities of the 21st century. Yet these institutions still claim global authority. This mismatch creates frustration. Countries that gained power feel underrepresented. Countries that lost influence resist reform. And the system stalls. The United Nations was meant to prevent global catastrophe. It succeeded in one sense. No world war has occurred since its creation, but it struggles to address modern conflicts. Veto power freezes action. Consensus is rare. Enforcement is weak. Many countries now see the UN less as a decision-maker and more as a forum, a place to speak, not to resolve. This doesn't make it useless, but it limits its authority. Economic growth reshaped the world. Political power did not keep up. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America now drive global growth, population increase, and resource demand. Yet their influence in global decision-making remains limited. This creates tension, not revolutionary anger, but persistent pressure. Calls for reform grow louder. Representation, voting power, leadership roles. The message is simple. A system that excludes the majority cannot remain legitimate. Global finance has long been centralized. Reserve currencies, payment systems, development lending. This concentration created efficiency, but also dependency. When access becomes conditional, countries seek alternatives. Regional development banks expand. Local currency trade increases. New financial infrastructure emerges. Not to overthrow the system, but to reduce vulnerability. Fragmentation accelerates. Importantly, new institutions rarely replace old ones outright. They coexist. They overlap. They compete quietly. This creates redundancy. And redundancy reduces leverage. No single institution controls access anymore. This is not collapse. It is diffusion. Institutions resist change by design. Stability depends on continuity. But pressure accumulates. Demographics shift. Economics evolve. Power redistributes. Eventually, reform happens, not because it's desired, but because it's unavoidable. The only question is timing, gradual adaptation, or crisis-driven overhaul. If institutions are fragmenting and power is diffusing, what happens to the ultimate guarantor of global order? Military force, and more importantly, nuclear weapons. In the next part, we'll explore nuclear proliferation, deterrence breakdown, and why a multipolar nuclear world is more dangerous than a bipolar one. For a brief moment after the Cold War, nuclear weapons faded from public attention. They didn't disappear. They simply moved into the background. Deterrence still existed. Arsenals remained intact. Doctrine stayed unchanged. But the world around those weapons changed. And now, nuclear risk is rising again, not because weapons are new, but because the system managing them is breaking down. During the Cold War, nuclear deterrence was terrifying, but stable. Two superpowers, Clear red lines. Predictable responses. Everyone understood the rules. Today, that clarity is gone. More nuclear states exist. Power is more evenly distributed. Trust is thinner. In a multipolar world, deterrence becomes fragmented. Each state has its own doctrine, its own thresholds, its own assumptions. This increases the chance of miscalculation. As global order fragments, incentives shift. Security guarantees weaken. Alliances feel less reliable. Threats feel closer. For some states, nuclear weapons appear less like a risk and more like insurance. Not for domination, but for survival. Even the perception of proliferation changes behavior. Once the idea spreads, restraint becomes harder. Modern technology compresses decision time. Cyber warfare blurs attribution. AI accelerates targeting. Hypersonic weapons reduce warning windows. This strains deterrence logic. Leaders have less time to verify information, less time to deliberate, less room for error. False alarms become more dangerous. In a world already full of mistrust, speed is not stability. Instead of a single global balance, multiple regional balances emerge, each with different histories, different rivalries, different escalation pathways. A crisis in one region no longer stays local. It ripples. Markets react. Alliances activate. Other powers reassess risk. Containment becomes harder. For decades, nuclear weapons were considered unthinkable to use. That taboo still exists, but it is under strain. As conventional conflicts escalate, as existential fears rise, as trust erodes, the psychological barrier weakens. Not because leaders want to cross it, but because the system that reinforced it no longer holds firm. Deterrence relies on rational actors, but rationality itself becomes contested in times of crisis. Domestic politics matter. Information environments distort reality. National narratives harden positions. Fear alone cannot manage complexity. And complexity is now the defining feature of global security. If nuclear weapons expose the dangers of fragmentation, what does this mean for everyday life, trade, and global prosperity? How does a multiplex world affect supply chains, energy, technology, and inequality? In the next part, we'll explore economic nationalism, deglobalization, and how the new world order reshapes daily life across the planet. For decades, globalization delivered one powerful promise: lower prices. Manufacturing moved to where labor was cheapest. Supply chains stretched across continents. Efficiency mattered more than resilience. That era is ending. In a multiplex world, security matters as much as cost. Countries are willing to pay more to control production, to shorten supply chains, to avoid dependence on rivals. This shift doesn't destroy global trade, but it changes its logic. Efficiency gives way to redundancy, and redundancy costs money. Economic nationalism was once considered extreme. Now it is mainstream. Governments intervene more directly in markets. Subsidies replace free trade. Tariffs become strategic tools. The goal is not isolation. It is control. Control over energy. Control over technology. Control over food and manufacturing. This reshapes capitalism itself. Markets still exist, but they are guided. States once trusted markets to allocate resources. Now they guide investment. Semiconductors, batteries, AI infrastructure, defense manufacturing. These sectors are no longer left to chance. Governments choose winners, or at least try to. This increases competition between states, not companies. And it ties economic success more tightly to national strategy. As production shifts, labor markets change. Some regions gain jobs, others lose them. Automation accelerates. Skills matter more than location. Inequality widens within countries, even as it narrows between some regions. The social contract comes under pressure. People expect protection, not just opportunity. And governments are increasingly judged on their ability to provide it. The digital world once felt borderless. That illusion is fading. Data localization laws expand. Technology standards diverge. Platforms fragment along political lines. The internet doesn't disappear. It splits. Different rules, different ecosystems, different information flows. This reshapes culture, media, and public trust. Energy security becomes central again. Not just oil and gas, but electricity, grids, and rare materials. Climate goals compete with geopolitical realities. Countries pursue renewables to reduce dependence. Others double down on traditional fuels for stability. Energy becomes both a tool and a vulnerability, and it shapes alliances more than ideology ever did. For ordinary people, the New World Order is subtle but persistent. Prices fluctuate. Choices narrow. News feels more polarized. The system becomes less predictable, but also more local. Regional identities strengthen. National debates intensify. Global narratives fragment. People feel the change even if they can't name it. People feel the change even if they can't name it. Transition to Part 8, the final question. If the world is becoming more fragmented, more multipolar, more sovereign, is this decline, or is it simply transformation? In the final part, we'll ask the biggest question of all. Is the New World Order more dangerous or more honest? And what choices still remain? For many people, the idea of a New World Order sounds ominous. It feels like decline, like chaos, like loss. But history suggests something more subtle. World orders don't end because they fail completely. They end because they stop matching reality. The post-war order was built for a moment when power was concentrated, growth was centralized, and threats were clear. That moment passed. What we are witnessing now is not the collapse of order, but the collapse of an illusion of permanence. A multiplex world is harder to manage. It has fewer rules everyone agrees on, more negotiations, more uncertainty, but it also has fewer absolute hierarchies. More voices matter. More regions shape outcomes. More paths exist. This system reduces domination, but increases complexity. It limits control, but expands agency. Whether that is better or worse depends on how societies adapt. Chapter 46. Why power is no longer everything. In the old order, power meant control. Control of trade routes. Control of finance. Control of institutions. In the new order, power is more fragile. Influence depends on cooperation. Leadership depends on credibility. Stability depends on restraint. Hard power still matters, but it is no longer sufficient. Reputation, resilience, and adaptability matter just as much. The greatest danger is not multipolarity itself. It is mismanagement. If leaders cling to outdated assumptions, if institutions resist reform too long, if fear overrides cooperation, then transition becomes conflict. But if adaptation happens gradually, imperfectly, but honestly, stability can emerge from diversity. History offers both outcomes. The choice is never automatic. Most people don't shape world orders, but they live inside them. Understanding the system reduces fear. Awareness replaces shock. Context turns confusion into clarity. The world is not ending. It is rearranging itself. And that process is messy, but not unprecedented. So here is the real question. Is the world becoming more dangerous? Or are we simply losing the comfort of believing someone else was in control? Is a multiplex world a threat to stability, or a correction to imbalance? And most importantly, what kind of order do we want to build next? Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.